Alright, so here we're going to talk about congruent triangles. What makes two triangles congruent? So here we have two triangles. This triangle here is triangle ABC. The other triangle we have is triangle XYZ. So let's say that we were told triangle ABC is congruent to triangle XYZ. So if we're told that these two triangles are congruent, well, that lets us know two things. For one, the corresponding angles will be congruent. So let's look at what that means. So angle A here corresponds with angle X, and I know that because the orientation of these two triangles are exactly the same. So these correspond with each other, and since they correspond, I know that they're congruent to each other. And remember, congruent means they have the same measure. Next, angle B, I'll put two arcs here. This one corresponds with angle Y, and since they correspond, I know they're congruent. So these two arcs let me know they're congruent to each other. And then lastly, we have angle C and angle Z. These two correspond with each other, so I'm going to place three arcs on these to show that these are the ones that correspond, and since they correspond, they're congruent to each other, meaning they have the same exact measure. So that's part one of the definition for congruent triangles, that the corresponding angles will be congruent. The other part is that the corresponding sides will also be congruent. So for instance, if I look at segment AB here, this side, I'll put one tick mark on that. This side corresponds with segment XY. And since they correspond, I know that they're congruent to each other, which means they have the same length. Next, I can see segment BC. This one corresponds with segment YZ. So I'll place two tick marks on these segments to say that they correspond with each other. And since they correspond with each other, I know that those are congruent sides. And since they're congruent, I also know they have the same length. And then lastly, I know I have segment AC. So I'll put three tick marks here. And then I'm going to put three tick marks on this corresponding side, segment XZ. Because these are corresponding sides, I know they're congruent. And since they're congruent, I also know they have the same length. So basically, this is what the definition of congruent triangles lets us know. And if I wanted to write it in notation, again, there's two parts. So you're going to have corresponding angles are congruent, and you're also going to know that the corresponding sides are congruent. So the angles that will be congruent would be angle A is congruent to angle X. We also knew that angle B, so I'll put a comma there, was congruent to angle Y. And we also knew angle C was congruent to angle Z. And again, these are all congruent because they were told to us that this is our congruent triangles. And since these angles correspond with each other, they have to be congruent by definition of congruent triangles. And then the other part of the definition says that the corresponding sides are going to be congruent as well. So the corresponding sides in these two triangles were segment AB, and that corresponded with segment XY. And since they correspond, we know they're congruent. The other corresponding sides were segment BC. That one corresponds with segment YZ. And since they correspond with each other, I know that those were congruent. And then lastly, segment AC and segment XZ corresponded with each other. So I know that those two sides were also congruent to each other as well. And again, this is all because we were told that the two triangles were congruent. And the definition of congruent triangles lets us know this information here. So if you're ever talking about congruent triangles, this is what you should be thinking of. We're able to say that this is true by definition. Now, if you look at this set of triangles, the orientation doesn't look exactly the same. It looks like it was changed around a little bit. So in this case, if you ever notice, the triangles look different, but you're told they're congruent, like for instance, let's say we were told triangle PQR was congruent to triangle EFG. So let's say you're told they're congruent. Even though they look different, sometimes, if they rotated one of the triangles around, the orientation looks different, so it doesn't look like they really match up. But again, if they tell you they're congruent, then by definition we know that we're going to have corresponding angles to be congruent and corresponding sides are going to be congruent. So one of the things that you can do to figure out which ones match up is we can stack these, the notation, we can stack them on top of each other. So for instance, I can take triangle PQR and I'm going to take the other triangle, the notation, and put it underneath EFG. So when I stack them like this, I can tell the letters that match up with each other, those are going to be the corresponding angles. So for instance, angle P, well, this angle will be on top, is above this angle E, so I know they're going to correspond with each other, and since they correspond, I know those two angles are going to be congruent. So if I want to, I could go in the picture and label that now. I can say angle P, well, this angle is congruent to angle E. So I have one arc on each side. If I look at the second letter, well, angle Q, that one is going to match up with angle F. So I know those two angles correspond, and since they correspond, they're congruent to each other. So I can say angle Q is congruent to angle F. And then lastly, R and G match up, so I can say angle R and angle G correspond, and since they correspond, I know they're congruent to each other as well. So I'm going to put 3 arcs on R and 3 arcs on G. So we know which angles are congruent now. And then I can also say which sides are congruent similarly. So for instance, if I picked any two letters, like for instance, P and Q, well, that means that segment PQ, that's going to match up with E and F, right? Because PQ is above E and F. So if I write those two out, I know that those are corresponding and therefore they're congruent to each other. So I'm going to mark segment PQ. This has one tick mark, and that's going to be corresponding with segment EF, which is this segment here. And I put a tick mark there, so I know those two sides are congruent. Then I pick another pair of letters, so I can say P and R. So segment PR, and the letters that line up with P and R, or that match up, are E and G. So that'd be segment EG. And I know those two are going to be congruent because they correspond. So segment PR and segment EG would be these two segments. So I'll put 2 tick marks on those. And I can see the last ones are going to match up. But if I look at the notation, I can see that I did PQ, I did PR. So the only other one left would be QR. So QR, that segment, well, that lines up with FG. So that one is going to be congruent with FG. So QR has 3 tick marks, and FG also has 3 tick marks. So those correspond, and since those sides correspond with each other, I know they're congruent to each other as well. So you can use this technique. So basically, like we did here, stack them up, and then you can see that for the angles, you just look at the letters that are in the same place, and those are going to be the corresponding angles, and therefore they're going to be congruent. And then when you're doing the segments to figure out which sides correspond, you can just pick any 2 letters and see what other 2 letters match up with those 2 that you picked. So like for instance, when we did P and Q, E and F were underneath P and Q, so I know that those 2 segments will be congruent with each other. So the other thing I wanted to point out too is that I ended up putting arcs on these triangles. So if some textbooks, you might see a little bit differently. So for instance, I'll change this around so you can see that you don't have to put the arcs if you don't want to. You could also do like 1 arc. So I know P and E were corresponding and they're congruent, so I can put an arc, and I can just put a tick mark if I want to. I know Q and F were congruent, so I can put here 2 tick marks for Q and F. And then I can see R and G were congruent, so I can put 3 tick marks on those. So for R and G. So that's another way you could do it too. You don't have to put arcs. You could just put tick marks on each arc here so you can see which ones match up. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out too is that in the case that, let's say, you did set this up this way, once you identify everything that corresponds, you could take your second triangle or your first triangle, doesn't really matter, and you could redraw it so that they're oriented in the same way, like we did in the previous example. So basically, since I know P matches up with E, Q, and F match up, and R and G, those angles are all corresponding, well, I can try my best to kind of redraw this triangle to look like the first triangle. And again, this is just freehand, so you could try your best. And then I know, again, angle P and E were in the same position, so I can say this is angle E. And then I know angle Q matches up with F, they correspond, so I say this one is F. And then R matches up with G, so R would match up over here with G. And then you could go ahead and, now that I have the same orientation, I basically rotated this to look like the first triangle. I know that my matching angles pretty much are all going to be the same now. So I can say that PR and EG are going to have 2 tick marks, right? Which we have PR and EG, those 2 segments. And then segment EF, I know that's going to match up with segment PQ. And then segment QR is going to match up with segment FG. Again, since I arranged this one to look like the first one, I rotated it. I know that everything else is going to match up exactly, so you can go ahead and label everything quickly. So that's an option if you want to, if it helps to see it better. But you don't have to. Only if depends on the problem. So if it helps, rearrange it, redraw it, like I did here. All right, but that's pretty much the definition of congruent triangles and how you label it in pictures.